with your Wenger English specialist. I wanted to speak to you about the English Language GCSE. I've already done a video on your literature where you'll be looking at Shakespeare text, a 19th century text, modern text and some poetry. So for the language paper it's a little different. You don't have text to prepare in quite the same way. Having said that, all the work you're doing on your literature texts, those skills you'll still be using for your language paper. So there's 3 different exam boards that do the language paper: OCR, Edexcel and AQA. They're all pretty similar, they're all testing the same skills. The way they word it slightly different, the mark scheme is slightly different, and the timings are slightly different. So I would advise you to spend some time working out how much time you can allow yourself for each question. Because what each exam board does is they start easy on small questions with low marks, and they build up as the paper goes to really large questions where they're going to want a lot of writing from you with big marks. We don't want you to run out of time by the time you get to the large questions where all the heavier marks are. So allow yourself a good 10 minutes really at the beginning to read the texts, read them thoroughly, get to know them. You're also going to want to leave yourself maybe 5 minutes at the end to reread things, to check for errors. Now the time you have left in between that, allocate that time per mark. So I know for AQA, for example, people say 1 minute, 1.5 minutes per mark. So now when you get to your first question, it's 4 marks, you know I can't spend more than 5 minutes on this. So with your language papers, there's 2 papers. One will be dealing with fiction, literature, stories. I'll give you a small extract of that. It's usually older, around 19th century, 20th century text, so it might feel a little bit dated. The second paper will be non-fiction, so possibly newspaper articles or letters, and both papers are testing different things. Your fiction paper, it wants you to understand how the writer is crafting his story to have an effect on the reader. The non-fiction papers are wanting you to work out how the writer feels, what's their attitude towards what they're writing about. In that paper, you'll have 2 texts to compare, an older one and a new one. The topic will be similar, so it could be 2 different newspaper articles on education, and one will be dated and one will be modern. And you'll need to look at what's the differences, compare, and work out how the writers are feeling, what's their attitude towards what they're writing about, and how do you know that? What's in the writing, what's in the way they're writing that allows you to work out what their attitude is. So one key thing for these papers, I can't tell you how to answer each question because it will be different depending on what the text is that you're given. So my biggest tip is to engage with that text. If it's a piece of fiction, spend time working out what mood is the writer creating? Is the writer trying to scare you, to entertain you, to make you laugh? What effect is the writer trying to have? Are they trying to lead you in one direction, make you think it's a nice happy story so they can create a big twist in the story? Are they trying to create mystery so they're leaving lots of elements out of their description? So when you're first reading, initially just try and get a feel of what's happening, but then try and work out what's the writer trying to do to you as a reader. Because they're trying to take you on some sort of journey. What is that journey? What effect are they trying to have? That's your starting point, and that will inform all your analysing that you begin to do on language and structure. Similarly, with the other paper, when it's non-fiction, already start thinking, how does this writer feel about their topic? If they're talking about education, how do they feel? For example, they may feel that education should be very strict. Students should shut up, be quiet and do as they're told. And their writing might be very strict and formal to mirror that. The comparison text might be a very forward-thinking view of education, that it should be child-led, that the teacher should adapt their teaching all the time to the needs of the student. So as you're reading it, try and work out what are their attitudes towards it. And maybe that person's writing in a more informal, fun, creative way that would mirror their views. So for the non-fiction, you're trying to find what are their views about what they're writing about and what's in the writing that helps us know that. Often writers will include humour. So if they include in humour, they probably feel quite light-hearted about the topic they're talking about. If they feel much more serious, and this is vital that you listen to me, they might have some very serious statistics in there. So for example, it could be a text where the writer feels passionate that people don't take care of cyclists on the road. So they might be filled with the amount of accidents cyclists have, to shock you, to make you take notice and change the way you behave as a driver of a car. So you take more care of the cyclist. So they're less likely to be using humour. They're more likely to be using statistics and evidence to show how important it is that you change the way you drive, for example. So for the fiction paper, you have lots of questions where you have to analyse the way the writer is writing. So you need to be analysing their language. How are they using language to create images? How are they using language to create an atmosphere? You also need to be analysing structure. How are they telling you the story? Are they describing it to you? Are they using dialogue? The writer always has a choice. He could describe that the man was angry and mean to his daughter, or he could allow that character, that father, to speak. And through the speaking, the dialogue between the father and the daughter, we could work out for ourselves, he's cruel to her. And the author has decisions to make on that. He has decisions to make on the order that he tells the story. Does he tell it chronologically in the order that it happens? Or does he start towards the end and use a flashback and go back to the beginning? These are all structural choices that the author has. And you need to be spotting them. What's the author doing with the language? What's the author doing with the structure? And how does that inform the story? How does that shape the experience for the reader? So it's never enough to spot, he's using a metaphor there. You must be specific about what is the effect of that metaphor. I was reading a text the other day and it talked about the family. The family's face were moulded in clay. The majority of my students could spot that was a metaphor, but they couldn't say the effect of that. So it's not enough to spot as a metaphor. It's good to spot as a metaphor. But if the faces were moulded in clay, think about what does that tell us about the family? Well, moulded in clay suggests a sculpture, usually cold, hard, lifeless. So you get this idea of this family then, that they're hard, they're cold, they're not laughing or interacting with each other. So actually this metaphor that their faces are moulded in clay tell us an awful lot about how they're behaving with each other. And it's that you need to get into. Yes, it's a metaphor, spot is a metaphor, but what's the relevance of that particular image, that particular metaphor in this particular story? What's the writer doing with that metaphor? What effect is he trying to have? What is he showing you? As well as being able to analyse language and structure, we also need to be able to evaluate, because one of the biggest questions in the reading part of your fiction paper, you need to be able to evaluate to what extent do you agree with something. So there'll often be a statement. In this part of the extract, the family are presented as cruel. To what extent do you agree? And then you'll be expected to write a good few paragraphs on how you feel about that. Now, when you're evaluating, you weigh up the options. On one hand, it could be this, and here's all my evidence for it, from the text, of course. On the other hand, it might be, we could see it as this, and then weigh it up. That's what we want from this evaluation, this ability to look at all things. And of course, with every single question, you must be using evidence from the text. So although you can have your own opinion, you must be using evidence from the text and analysing that evidence. With that evaluation question, you're not limited to only talk about language or only talk about structure. You can talk about anything, characterisation, mood, anything that backs up your position, your argument. With the non-fiction, we also need to be analysing language, but it's often more persuasive techniques that the writer might be using, because they're not trying to tell you a story, so they're not necessarily bringing pictures to life in your head, but they will be trying to influence you. They might be trying to inform you, they might be giving you information, they might be trying to persuade you of something, to start recycling more, or whatever it is. So you need to work out on the non-fiction, what is it they're trying to do to the reader? Once you decide that, it will be easier to work out what they're doing with the language. If they're trying to argue and persuade you that they're right about something, that you should recycle more, for example, they're probably going to have a lot of evidence in there. They might have figures, facts and figures to say how much waste we're creating. They might have some emotive language in there to make us feel guilty about how much we're damaging the planet. So the language skills are probably going to be different for the non-fiction than they are for the fiction. The fiction is probably going to be more metaphor, similes, these devices we use to create pictures in the reader's head. Non-fiction is probably more persuasive techniques. Maybe they're going to use expert opinion or statistics to show they know what they're talking about, so they can provide you with evidence to make their position sound more reliable. So I've been talking about the first half of both papers, where you're being assessed on your ability to read and analyse people's writing. The second half, and it forms half of your language GCSE, is your own writing skills. Now, on the fiction paper, you're asked to write a piece of fiction, a narrative, a story. All those things you've been analysing in the author's work, you now need to demonstrate in your own work. You need to be using this sort of heightened language, this poetic style of writing with all your metaphors and similes. You're never just going to describe a table. It's going to be a cold, hard table standing like a rock. I mean, that was awful, but you know what I mean. It's going to be a more heightened way of speaking than you would be used to doing. You're going to avoid telling the person what it is that's happening, and instead you're going to try and show the reader what's happening through your words. So for example, instead of saying the old man crosses the road, you might describe a hunched over man with white hair, wrinkled face, taking each step gingerly as he crosses the road. Now we have to do some work. The reader will be able to work out, it's an old man crossing the road. And that is how you draw the reader in. So avoid telling us what's happening, show us with pictures. So you need to be able to ideally see it in your head and then paint the picture with words so that I can then see it in my head when I'm reading it. Don't worry so much about plot. You only got, 45 minutes probably to write a story. They're not going to expect an elaborate plot. Keep the plot really simple and focus much more on this descriptive way of writing, this way of bringing your writing to life. Do think about structure and do plan structure. Are you going to use a flashback? Are you going to use dialogue? Where's your focus going to be? Is it going to be describing the whole scene in the first paragraph, and then in the second paragraph you zoom into the character? Maybe you have a single line sentence or a single word paragraph. You need to plan those elements in because they usually don't just happen naturally. And of course you have a written part for your non-fiction as well, and this is more when you're going to have to persuade someone of something. So just think about how do you persuade people to do what you want, and incorporate some of those skills into your own writing. And the important thing for this non-fiction piece of writing is you must sound passionate about it. It may be something you don't care less about, but you've got to write in a way as though this is the most important thing to you. So you've got to write with this urgency and this passion. So although it is non-fiction, persuasive piece of writing, also it is a little bit of fiction, and you might want to incorporate some of these statistics that we talk about, or expert opinion, and as fact to back up your argument. Now, you're not going to have those to hand, and you're not going to Google that, so actually you are going to have to make that up. So you are actually going to have to be quite creative when writing your non-fiction piece. That was a lot of information about the English language. I hope you can pick something out there that's helpful to you. If you have any questions, you want any more information on anything, do get in touch. Thanks for listening.